Joining me now is one of the smartest writers I know. He is a staff writer at The Atlantic. He writes about economics, technology, and media. He's also the author of some really good books, Hitmakers. He's the host of Crazy Genius podcast. He's also a contributor to NPR and CBS. Everybody wants to get Derek Thompson on their show because he's real smart and great at talking. Follow him on Twitter, where he's also prolific at DK Tomp. That's THOMP, DK Tomp. Derek, thank you very much for joining me. Your lighting on our Zoom is perfect. It's really.
Is it vaguely yellow? I don't want to make it look too jaundiced, lest you think that I have some other 19th century illness.
Yeah, no, you look perfectly orange. Actually, okay. No, it's great. Thank you for joining me, man. I appreciate it. I wanted to start our conversation by talking about the latest projections on unemployment. People are really obviously worried first and foremost about their health, but secondarily about their wealth, their job. You've been writing some really great articles. Everybody should subscribe to The Atlantic, which is doing excellent work in this time. What are the projections right now for how bad the unemployment numbers are going to be?
So they're really, really bad. Let me start by contextualizing it this way. We're not going to know what the official unemployment rate for March is for 2 weeks. That's when the Bureau of Labor Statistics is going to release its labor report. And then that report is going to be revised over the next 2 months. So we're not going to get a perfectly clear picture of the March unemployment rate until really June. But here's what we know right now. We recently had initial unemployment claims up over 2 million. Now, how bad is 2 million for weekly initial claims? Well, the worst week in the last 50 years was 695,000. So we just had a week that was 3 times worse than the worst week of the last 50 years when it comes to initial claims. That's really bad. Here's what's also really bad. There was a Marist poll that surveyed Americans on March 13th and 14th. It said that 18% of them had either been let go or had their hours reduced, 18%, so almost 1 in 5. And for lower income workers making less than $50,000, that figure was 25%. So for workers making less than average wages in this country, 1 in 4 now have either been let go or had their hours reduced. This is, as my colleague Annie Lowrey wrote, a catastrophe that is less akin to a recession and more akin to a sudden ice age. The economy is freezing. It is coming to an absolute sudden stop. And as a result, we're going to see numbers, I think, in the next few weeks that just don't have precedent in not just modern American history, but maybe American history period.
And as you write in one of your most recent pieces at The Atlantic, the coronavirus will be a catastrophe for the poor. And you write, ground zero for the pandemic's threat to the labor force are the face-to-face services and leisure economy, much of which have been forcibly shut down by the governments to prevent the spread of the virus. We're talking about industries in entertainment and leisure. You mentioned workers in sales people, waiters, hotel desk clerks, groundskeepers, maids, entertainment attendants. They all have a few things in common. And you talk about their wages and labor protections and lack of other benefits. Help us understand why this is going to be so bad for people that aren't making that much money, these wage earners.
Well, it sucks for a few reasons. It obviously sucks that you're going to see unemployment rise probably over 10%, meaning that it'll be the highest rate in at least 70 years. That's terrible. But what adds to the sucky picture is the fact that low-income workers were actually making some impressive yet quiet gains in the last few years. As a result of rising minimum wage laws, as a result of historically low unemployment, the Affordable Care Act as well, you had a sort of quietly good 6 years for low-income workers after many decades of rising inequality. In fact, both the Bureau of Labor Statistics and a couple other economic sources seem to indicate that wages were rising fastest for lower-income workers in the 4 years before 2020. And so this isn't just a terrible thing that's happening to the whole economy. It's also arresting, stopping in place, and almost certainly reversing a really good thing that was happening for low-income workers because of all these developments in the labor force. And so in that sense, what I wrote in this piece is that it's sort of shockingly and depressingly similar to the 1918 pandemic. The 1918 pandemic, of course, came after the Gilded Age, where inequality soared, but it also came after the beginning of the Progressive Era, where you had a lot of laws being passed that strengthened labor, that made sure that we were, taxing the rich more with a ratified amendment to allow for an income tax in 1916. And then suddenly, 2 years later, you have the pandemic strike, and it just disproportionately hurts the poor. In many ways, I see this as akin to that you had, decades of rising inequality, followed by a few years that were really good for low-income workers, where they were really beginning to make strides. And now this is just punching us all right in the face.
Well, the answer to that depressing as hell explanation, but honest and real, is another article you wrote for The Atlantic titled "Give People Money Immediately," where you talk about macroeconomic theory, saying there's basically two ways to address a crisis like this: monetary policy and fiscal policy. What's the difference? Which is more effective? And are we seeing any movement from the federal government on these?
Yeah, I mean, from the Federal Reserve, they've cut interest rates, which is what they should be doing. That's monetary policy. But monetary policy can't really give people money. It can cut rates and, make it easier for people to borrow money and distribute loans. But that's not what the economy needs in the next few weeks. What it needs is money in the hands of individuals who are obviously losing their jobs immediately. And look, there's a couple ways you can do that. You can, cut people checks, as the government might be trying to do. You can beef up unemployment insurance. People are already losing their jobs, so they could, if they file for unemployment benefits, we want to make sure that they're getting a lot of money so they can continue to make rent, buy groceries and essentials for their family. I will say this, though. I'll give you a little preview of the article, my next article that's going up. I'm really curious about what Denmark is doing, and not just because I fetishize Scandinavian countries, although I do that, I suppose, to a certain extent, but also I recently read that Denmark went really, really big to defeat the unprecedented challenge of the coronavirus. They essentially agreed that they would pay 75% of employees' salaries at companies that were facing mass layoffs. So essentially, they are agreeing to pay for the vast majority of people's salaries at all these different companies that are going through these problems, at restaurants, at amusement parks, at airlines. The government essentially is going to come in and be the co-employer of these people. I mean, this truly is socialism, and I would say defensible socialism, because the government is essentially forcibly shutting down the private sector to make sure the coronavirus doesn't continue to course through the system. So I talked to an economist in Denmark, and I said, how much is this going to cost? He told me 13% of Denmark's GDP is going to be dumped into the system over the next 13 weeks. All right? 13% of GDP spent in 13 weeks. What would be the equivalent in the US? That's a 2.5 trillion, with a T, $2.5 trillion economic stabilization package that would have to be passed essentially yesterday and would take effect over the next 3 months.
You're talking about 2.5 trillion because our GDP is what, 18 trillion?
19 trillion. Yep.
19. Okay. So when the reason you point that out, just to be clear, is because when you hear conversations and proposals from the United States Congress for any kind of stimulus, the numbers are
closer to 1 trillion. It's closer to 1 trillion. So what I'm essentially saying is that as big as the conversation that's being had right now in Washington, I think that what we might have to do has to be twice as big. And so I just think we need to begin to wrap our heads around that, because I feel like every single week throughout this pandemic, ideas and numbers that seemed insane on Friday became totally believable and even optimistic by Monday. And so we need to get our heads around the fact that as big as $2 trillion sounds, in 2 weeks, $2 trillion might seem like, oh God, if only we had passed that 2 weeks ago, we would be in a much better place in this recovery. And so I think it's really important to talk to people overseas that are dealing with a similar crisis, but have a larger appetite for government spending. What are they doing? What do they think is appropriate? And the answer there seems to be 2.5 trillion.
I feel like there should be another, and I've seen this, I think, in Italy and in other countries as well, a proposal. Derek, correct me if I'm wrong, but what are the biggest bills? I don't want to know anything about the biggest bills because I can't swallow them. Bills that Americans have to pay. I would assume it's your rent or your mortgage. And what I've seen from Italy, Obviously, there's healthcare bills, but what I've seen, they're suspending mortgage payments. I've heard those types of proposals floating around as well here. That certainly would benefit my wife and I and other people. Do you hear anything, and what do you think of the idea of suspending rent or mortgage payments?
I think it's justified given the following explanation. What's happening right now is that I believe I think Larry Summers first coined this terminology, so I'm borrowing a little bit from him. He said what's happening now is that economic time has been stopped, but financial time is not. And what does that mean? Let's say you're a restaurant, right? Economic time has been stopped. That means you have no more customers, there's no more receipts, there's no more tips, there's no more food being prepared, all right? All of that is frozen. But what hasn't been frozen is that you still have to make rent. And you still have to pay back loans to people who gave you money so that you could buy a bunch of stuff to fill out the interior decoration of the restaurant. And you still maybe have to pay labor costs, whether it's paying people who are still with you or paying people who recently left you. So financial time hasn't stopped. And what Italy is saying there, or Spain, or other people that are considering freezes on mortgages, they're essentially saying, all right, we've already declared a stoppage of economic time. If we want to avert the greatest catastrophe for our people, we also have to declare a stoppage of financial time as well. And that means saying, all right, you're not getting income coming in, so there's no money to go out. As a result, let's freeze payments that are going out, payments to lenders, payments to the bank for your mortgage. I think that is their way of trying to create sort of synchronicity between the stoppage of economic and financial time.
All right, last question on one of your most recent articles at The Atlantic, titled "The Coronavirus is Creating a Huge Stressful Experiment in Working from Home." I really enjoyed this article. I've been working from home for the past 4 or 5 months now, and used to do a day a week. And I liked it, and I've gotten used to it in a lot of ways. But you looked at a paper, a study titled "Does Working from Home Work?" And you broke that down and a few other things. Tell us a little bit about this, what we learned in this article. People should go read the entire thing at The Atlantic.
Sure. I'm a fan of remote work for the future. I think that remote work in the future, which will involve a lot of working from home, is good for the environment.
Yep.
It's good for reducing commute time, which is an environmental and psychological scourge on our lives.
Yep.
It's good for family life. And it, ideally, with the right kind of, personal conscientiousness and routine, is good for work-life balance. At the same time, I think there's a lot of people who are advocates for remote work, who are really excited about this experiment that we're all going through right now. And I want to tell them to shut the hell up, because this is not a good work from home experiment. This is a quarantine pandemic in which we are all, well, 30% of Americans, forced to work from home. It should also be said that 70% of Americans cannot work from home. They work as waiters. They work at the airport. They, work in the retail sector. And as a result, they have no choice but to either go to work or be fired, be laid off, be furloughed. And so the point of the article is to do two things. It's to defend this vision of the future of remote work, but also to give people a dose of reality and say that what we're living through right now is not a vision of the future. In the future, where a lot of people are working remote, working from home, they don't also have to take care of their kids when school is canceled. They don't also have to live in a world where restaurants have been forcibly closed and they can't go walking outside because they're under house arrest because of the California law. So I think let's be realistic about both the benefits of remote work and the crisis of the moment.
Derek, I appreciate your time. Last question. How do you think the federal government is handling this versus state governments? Is there a way to even answer that quickly?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a rather grotesque caricature of what we sort of call federalism, right? The good picture of federalism is that we have a competent federal government that delegates a lot of responsibilities to the private sector in the states, and everybody does their job, right? In this case, lots of companies are doing their job. Lots of local and state governments are doing their job. And the federal government, at least until about 2 weeks ago, was totally falling down on the job. And it was led in the executive branch by a president who was denying that there was a crisis to respond to anyway. So it remains to be seen how far behind the 8 ball that's put us, how bad the executive branch's screw up has screwed us. At the same time, it must be said that there are a lot of heroes in this crisis, in the private sector and at the state and local government level, and their heroism should be called out.
The president said yesterday, this was a comment that a lot of people, I think, didn't pick up on, but he said the federal government is not a shipping company. And I thought about that for a second, Derek. I thought, yeah, they are. That's a huge part of what they do is procurement and getting products and supplies and people to people, right? I mean,
I'm pretty sure that the Defense Department is the single largest procurer of private sector services in the United States. They have a budget of $700 billion or more. That's significantly larger than the budget of just about any other company in the world or in the history of the world. So yeah, that explanation doesn't make any sense. But I would say that Trump has built a mountain of statements that don't make any sense, and so this is a mere pebble on the mountain.
It's called Bullshit Mountain, and you can visit it now. Derek Thompson, as always, I appreciate you joining me here on the podcast. Follow him on Twitter at DKTomp, THOMP. Subscribe to The Atlantic, get his books, and listen to his podcast as well. It's Crazy Genius. Derek, thank you. Keep up the good work. Listen to Stand Up with Pete Dominic anywhere you get your podcasts and subscribe to youtube.com/standupwithpete.